Restorative justice evolved from the search for more productive ways of dealing with crime than just putting more and more people away in prison. It means restoring victims, restoring offenders, and restoring communities. It's about the idea that because crime hurts, justice should heal. In a typical process, you'll first have the victim approach. The victim will be asked to say who they would like to come along to support them through the ordeal. Then the offender would be approached in the same way, and supporters of the offender with the offender come together with the victim, and the victim's supporters, a facilitator. They sit in a circle. First, they'll talk about what happened, who was hurt by what happened, and what might be done to right the wrong. They'll come up with a plan of action, and then there'll be follow-up to check that the plan of action is actually implemented to the satisfaction of all the stakeholders. So the selection principle is exactly the opposite to that in a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, you invite along to the trial those who can inflict most damage on the other side. With the Restorative Justice Conference, you invite along those who can offer most support. Now, there's been a lot of research on the effectiveness of these conferences and other restorative justice processes now. For example, Heather Strang and Lawrence Sherman here at the Australian National University have done work in Canberra where they've randomly assigned 1,400 criminal offenders to a traditional criminal trial versus a restorative justice conference. And what they found is that levels of satisfaction, both on the victim side and the offender side, on the part of the police and the community, are higher in the cases that go to a restorative justice conference than in the cases that go to court. Now, that research also shows that remorse is important, that in cases where reoffending is less likely, there will be cases where the offender comes to a position of remorse about what he or she has done, as opposed to denial, as opposed to hooking up to the kind of emotional resources that criminal subcultures provide to offenders. So the criminal subcultures provide offenders with a whole range of different kinds of scripts for allowing you to reject your rejectors, to saying those who are accusing you of terrible things, they're really the bad people, they're really the ones who got what they deserve. That's the thing that we want through a more conversational form of regulation to break through, to break down, to help the offender to see the harm that he or she really has done to their victims. And this is why in the way that I think theoretically about restorative justice processes, shame is very important. Criminal justice processes are always heavily laden with shame. It's not possible to have something like a criminal trial without a lot of shame being felt, maybe suppressed, displaced shame, so that the shame is projected back onto those who are accusing you. But shame there is, and usually in a deep form. Now, how do we distinguish between the form of shame that leads to feelings of remorse and counterproductive forms of shame that lead you to blame others for what's happened rather than take responsibility for it yourself? The distinction I make is between reintegrative shaming, which is a productive form of confronting people about what they've done wrong, and stigmatisation. Now, in stigmatisation, what we do is we say, you're a bad person who has done a bad thing. In reintegrative shaming, the message we're trying to communicate is that we believe you're an essentially good person who has done a bad thing, and we want to discuss why there were these bad consequences of what you've done, and what it is that you might be able to do to transcend that harm, to repair the harm, to make good, to to go on to be an even better person than the essentially good person we believe you to be. And that's why reintegration is very important. One thing that a lot of people are concerned about, of course, is whether this is more effective in reducing crime, in reducing reoffending, than traditional criminal process. Well, as more and more evidence has been accumulated on that evidence has become more and more encouraging. Large number of studies now that have been reviewed by the Canadian Department of Justice showing that cases that go to a restorative process have lower levels, statistically significantly lower levels of reoffending compared to cases that go to the court. And rather more encouraging is that there's kind of the second generation restorative justice programs that have been crafted since 1996 have much greater effectiveness than programs that were designed before 1996. So we seem to be learning how to do this stuff better. So the idea of having so many people in the circle is that you're not relying on the facilitator to come up with solutions. You're empowering the creativity, the ideas, the contributions that many different citizens coming at the problem from different angles can make to solving it. The very first conference I ever attended was in Wagga in New South Wales, and as we were arriving at the conference with the facilitator, we met the mother of the 14-year-old girl who was the offender in this case. She was a big-time burglar who was actually cleaning out houses. She was homeless, living on the street, making a life as a professional burglar. We arrived at the conference venue. The mother of this girl was there, arriving at the same time. She said to the facilitator, "I'm not happy about being here, Facilitator says, "Give it a try, let's just see how we go," and caresses and cajoles her into entering into the conference room to give the restorative justice process a try. As she comes into the room where the conference is being held, she sees her daughter already sitting in the circle and says to her, "I'll kill you, you little bitch," to which the daughter says something slightly more appropriate like, "Hi, Mum." We get on with the conference. We're only 2 or 3 minutes into it, and Mum is up, points a shaking finger at her daughter, saying, "This is a load of nonsense. She should be punished," storms out of the conference. I look across to the facilitator saying, "Well, this is my first experience of a conference. It's really a great process, isn't it?" And in practice, it actually was a successful conference, because what then happened at the conference is that the victims who also arrived at the conference, very angry, had a very different kind of insight into the kind of circumstances this girl was in that was causing her to be a homeless child living on the streets of Wagga. And indeed other members of the extended family had a different way of looking at the circumstances of this 14-year-old girl. And indeed an uncle became a very important player in the process of reintegration of that 14-year-old girl. And not only were there apologies to the victims of her burglaries and doing what she could to do a bit of community work. I think it might have been painting some fences. She didn't have much in the way of money she could give back that which she still did have, do a bit of work for these families, apologise to them, but in the plan of action, give undertakings to go back to school. She wasn't going to school at all, and to help her to find members of the extended family who she could live with as an alternative to living with her mother, so that the underlying root causes of homelessness and dropout from school were addressed in the conference through the agencies of other members of the family, such as an uncle who steps in when they can see that the parents are not the ones who are going to show the leadership to solve this problem. A lot of the research and development on restorative justice was done on crime, but now we're seeing more and more evaluation of applications of restorative justice in other areas. For example, child protection, children who've been neglected or abused by their family group conferences to come up with a plan of action with that kind of problem. Also with children, for restorative justice for bullying in schools and other kinds of misbehaviours and conflicts that occur in school grounds, where sometimes children are learning themselves to be the facilitators of the conferences. Now, the reason we think in this what's now become a social movement for restorative justice, that restorative justice in schools is particularly important, is that, today there's a lot of cynicism about democracy, that elites run everything, and that children, this worry that children are not getting opportunities to learn how to be active democratic citizens. We're not born democratic. We need to learn how to be democratic, how to take active responsibility for righting the wrongs. And restorative justice is about this idea of active responsibility. Traditional criminal law is about passive responsibility. We will hold you responsible for what you have done in the past. Restorative justice is about active responsibility, about citizens taking responsibility for putting things right into the future. It's about a democratic virtue of active citizenship, not just on the part of the offender, but on the part of those supporters who come along to the restorative justice process to help mend, reconcile, create a record that there's a truth that needs to be told about an injustice that has been done here. All cultures have restorative justice traditions, and they have punitive, retributive traditions for dealing with violence against them. And what the social movement for restorative justice is about is saying to people, in this context of an opportunity now arising for peacemaking, your restorative justice traditions are going to be more useful for you than your retributive traditions. There is evidence that elite mediation with war can be effective. But the evidence is also that it's often not very effective in bringing about a permanent peace. That is to say, if there are still the hatreds in the hearts of those two people which haven't been dealt with by the elite mediation, that there's a risk that that conflict will break out in the next generation. The child who has seen their parents abused, tortured in their village will be looking for the opportunity when they become adults to exact revenge. And one of the things we're learning about restorative justice in armed conflict is that while these elite negotiations between warlords and heads of state take a long time to come to agreement, it takes meeting after meeting after meeting, and then a lot of time to disarm the armies that are involved in the conflict. During the years and months while that's going on, ordinary people can begin to reconcile village to village. So we saw this very well, for example, in the armed conflict between Muslims and Christians 10 years ago in Ambon and Maluku provinces of Indonesia, for example, where one of the things we saw happening was Christian villagers who had raided a nearby Muslim village, burning down the houses, burning down the mosque, killing a lot of people, start to rebuild the mosque to invite the Muslims who have fled to come back. And other cases in that same area where Muslim communities start rebuilding the Christian church and then invite the Christian community to come back. Those sort of acts of reconciliation, and sometimes whole villages aren't ready to take those collective steps toward reconciliation. It might be just one person who knew that they were responsible for burning down a particular house in the village down the road and start the work on rebuilding that single house. And that little relation, micro relationship between that perpetrator of violence and that victim then becomes a bridge which expands between connecting these two villages back together. Mary Kaldor uses the notion in her book New and Old War of islands of civility. She thinks that after any armed conflict you can always find, if you look hard enough, some islands of civility. So where people are continuing to live peaceably together, notwithstanding all of the conflict and hatred and killing that's been going on around them. So her idea is you start out working in civil society with that islands of civility and try to gradually expand out that island of civility, and you do that kind of work while the top-down peace building is also occurring. So you're doing peace building bottom-up, top-down, and also middle-out in all directions. So restorative justice is a philosophy of how we live our daily lives as well. And it's when people do the most terrible injustice to us that we have the greatest opportunities to do that special kind of good in the world through taking the restorative path rather than the vengeful path. And it's through seeing how extraordinary people do that in public space as well, who have more public lives, like the Dalai Lama, like Nelson Mandela, who's capable of doing something that most of us would not be capable of doing after 28 years in harsh conditions in a prison of apartheid South Africa, breaking rocks in the sun. He's able, when he's inaugurated as president of South Africa, to invite to sit along beside him the men who were his jailers during those years.